There is a moment just before you fall asleep in an unfamiliar place, when your body has gone quiet, but your mind continues to move. You notice things you wouldn't notice during the day. The walls seem to carry sound differently. How silence settles like weight in some rooms, but not others. How in certain dark places you don't sense the absence of light so much as the presence of something that has no need for it. These are things you feel and simultaneously disbelieve. Things you laugh off. Most people forget this feeling, erase it. They roll over, close their eyes, tell themselves it's just exhaustion, just an unfamiliar environment, just one of the things the brain does when it goes somewhere new. That clever organ is playing tricks on you. And for most people, this usually turns out to be true. But some places don't behave the way they're supposed to. Some places don't forget people. They remember them immediately, not in the way we understand remembering. They remember with a patience that has nothing to do with time, and sometimes the one that place has been waiting for arrives, not in a way that announces itself, not in a way that could survive a reasonable conversation. There is a path you don't remember walking, but that feels familiar beneath your feet. A stone you might not stoop to touch, but whose smell and texture you feel as the scent of wet rock in your hair. A church bell that tightens your chest before the sound has even finished its journey. And then, slowly, the unknown thing waiting alongside you begins to close the distance between you. Ingrid Halvorsen was 24 when her university research grant took her away from Oslo for the first time. She was finishing her master's degree in cultural history and had been assigned to assist a visiting academic named Professor Elias Ravn, a man who, in the carefully polished language of Norwegian academia, specialized in medieval religious transitions. This was the academic way of saying he studied the period when Christianity arrived in Norway, as if the decision had already been made elsewhere, and refused to share the land with whatever had lived there before it. The assignment itself seemed almost lethally dull. Workers restoring a ruined chapel near the edge of Jotunheimen, in a remote valley, had demolished a collapsed wall and found carvings in the stone beneath. Old carvings, wrong carvings, the kind that had no business being in a building dedicated to Christian prayer. The diocese grew uneasy. The municipality closed the site on a pretext, and the university was quietly asked to send someone who could identify the symbols without anyone having to hear about it. Ravn accepted the assignment before the email had fully loaded. He then requested, in his words, a student assistant who was patient, observant, and not easily unsettled. Ingrid spent a good deal of time afterward thinking about that last part. The village was called Skarsvik. By no meaningful measure was it large enough to be called a village. A narrow-towered stone church, a handful of dark timber houses, a closed ferry dock, and an old house whose upper floor Ingrid and Ravn had offered to rent from its owner. What made the place feel wrong from the beginning wasn't something you could photograph or put in a report. It was the mountains. They hung above the valley in the wrong scale, designed to make human habitation feel like a mistake. At night, they didn't look like landscape. They looked like something that had temporarily decided to stop moving and might change its mind. Ingrid noticed her first feeling on the second evening she spent there. She had gone out for a walk after dinner. She had a habit of clearing her head by walking in cold air. It helped her. The valley was quiet in the way remote places are quiet, full of small sounds that become immense when there is nothing large enough to swallow them. She walked further than she intended, found herself drawn, without knowing why, to the churchyard, and behind the rear wall, between two old headstones, half buried in the snow, she found a long groove in the ground, not quite a path. More like the impression left by something heavy that had used the same route many times, the earth finally yielding and giving way. She went home and said nothing. Ravn was so absorbed in his translations that he didn't even notice Ingrid's face. He said the carvings showed transitional characteristics, Old Norse binding runes with Latin crosses carved directly over them, a warning with a prayer nailed over its mouth. "This is never accidental," he said, still looking at his notes. When one belief system needs to bury another, it buries it deepest where it feels the old thing pushing back the most. She asked what the old thing had been pushing against. He laughed the way academics sometimes do when they find a simple question beneath answering honestly. Whatever people still feared when they stopped daring to name it, he said. That night she woke to a sound with no name. Something moving against the outer wall of the building. Not footsteps, not branches. Something slower and heavier. A dragging sound that followed a silence so precise it felt deliberate, as if something had paused to listen. She lay motionless in the dark, heart beating vast and intimate in the silence of the room. Then directly beneath her window, she heard a breath. Low, wet, neither quite animal nor quite anything else. When she finally made herself rise and look through the curtain, there was nothing below but the blue-white of moonlight on snow, and at the base of the wall, an impression pressed into the frozen ground. A track too large to belong to anything that had business wandering the village at 3 a.m. She didn't mention that either. The local priest arrived at the site the following day without warning. His name was Father Mikkel, a narrow-built man in his late 60s, pale-eyed, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years absorbing other people's fear with no one to pass it to. He did not welcome Raven warmly. He asked what had been uncovered, what had been moved, whether anyone had touched the stones of the altar with bare hands. When Ingrid said she had helped brush snow from the entrance on the first day, the priest looked at her with a silence she would later wish she had earned less quickly. He asked whether she had heard the church bells at night. She said no. Father Mikkel looked only slightly relieved. Raven and Father Mikkel disagreed from the start, and they argued. The professor was a scientist. His position was academic. Trolls, mountain spirits, valley curses, all of it. Cultural patterns of a society processing the trauma of religious conversion. Old fear taking new shape. He did not, in truth, want to believe in the existence of anything, but he was also thinking about what he saw scientifically. Father Mikkel's position was harder to refute, but easier to ignore. His grievance was that he had told the priest outright that an impression like that could not form in frozen ground on its own. He said the old belief was not myth. He said the findings needed urgent investigation. It was a system, an arrangement between people and earth, mountain and dark, blood and stone. Christianity had not changed that system. It had shattered it, and some things, when shattered, might not have ceased to exist. They had resisted in order to survive and become invisible. When the cross came, some things did not leave, said Father Mikkel that afternoon, to Ingrid, not to Raven. They only went deeper. 3 nights later, Ingrid began to sleepwalk. At first she didn't know. She only knew that she woke tired and cold, with the smell of wet rock in her hair and a bone-deep chill that didn't respond to extra blankets or hot water. On the 4th morning, she found a dark line of frozen mud crossing the wooden floor of her room from the foot of her bed to the door. The landlady mentioned almost in passing that she had noticed the front door open around 3 a.m. She had assumed one of the university guests had gone out for air. Ingrid said nothing. That same afternoon, cataloguing loose stones behind the chapel, she found a scrap of grey wool wedged in a crack in the wall. It matched her scarf exactly. When Raven finally noticed her trembling hands, she told him. He listened with interest, genuine interest, but the kind not directed at her. He was interested in the pattern. The site, he said, might contain geological structures, producing low-frequency sound emissions, mineral compounds known to cause disorientation in enclosed spaces, environmental suggestion reinforced by isolation and disrupted sleep. The human mind, he reminded her, was deeply and embarrassingly sensitive to context. Remote valley, ancient stone, winter dark, folklore in the air, ideal conditions for experiences that feel external but are not. Ingrid wanted to believe him. She almost did. Then he unrolled the parchment impression from the most deeply carved stone, the one beneath 3 others they hadn't reached yet, and showed her a line in Old Norse he had just finished translating, Not bride, not daughter, chosen. He explained carefully, in the measured tone of someone wanting to stay calm, because he knew the alternative would be undignified. The phrase appeared in pre-Christian sources, connected to what scholars called mountain presentations. Not sacrifice in the theatrical sense, not blood and fire, but something older and stranger. A marking, a recognition. The idea that something dwelling in certain mountains could, over sufficient time, fix upon a person, identify them, claim them, call them across barriers that should have been impassable. Ingrid stared at the word until it stopped looking like language and started looking like a sound. Then, in a voice she was trying not to let become thin, she asked whether he believed something carved into a stone 1,000 years ago could still do something to a living person. Raven paused longer than he should have before saying no. The hidden passage was not found by searching. Ingrid was alone in the chapel near dusk, collecting the day's equipment, when one of the flagstones beneath her boot produced a hollow sound. Just once. Soft and complete, like something answering a question. She knelt and cleared away sand and ice with numb fingers, finding an iron ring set into the stone. When she pulled, the slab shifted with a groan that seemed older than the building above it, older than the people who built it, older than whatever had brought them to put a church here. The passage below was narrow and cut directly into the living rock of the mountain. It had not been built, it had been carved. Extravagantly so, the kind of work you would not undertake without a purpose, serious enough to justify that much darkness and that much time. Cold air rose in slow, steady exhales, but beneath the cold, beneath the smell of earth and mineral, there was something else, something Ingrid felt in her chest, with no sense she could name, recognition, as if the darkness below had been aware of her since the moment she arrived, and had only been waiting for her to find the door. Raven insisted on descending that night. Father Mikkel refused and forbade it. The argument that followed was the last civil disagreement between them. The priest drew a cross over the entrance. Raven laughed at him. Ingrid said nothing. She was still standing at the edge of the opening, feeling the cold rise around her wrists, thinking about the word in the stone, chosen. They descended anyway. The tunnel opened after 20 meters into a cave, where the ceiling dissolved into shadow, too deep for their headlamps to reach. The walls were covered in carvings, partially concealed by centuries of mineral deposit. Figures with enormous hands, horn shapes, snakes coiled around crossed-out suns, and crowned men standing at the feet of mountains that dwarfed them. At the far end of the chamber stood a stone seat that was neither quite throne nor quite altar, surrounded by iron crosses so old they had fused with the surrounding rock. Father Mikkel began praying aloud, with every breath in his body. Raven moved toward the carvings with shaking hands. Ingrid could not move at all. On the seat, beneath a thick layer of dust and time, lay a braid of human hair the color of old ash. There are moments when fear goes very quiet. Not louder, quieter and more precise, as if something inside has stopped performing and started working. Ingrid knew the braid was human hair before Raven touched it. She knew, with a certainty that lived beneath logic, that it had not been left there as a symbol or decoration. It had been stored, the way you store something that belongs to a relationship, something that carries a claim. Raven lifted it carefully. Beneath it was a silver cross folded nearly in half, as if someone had tried to force two completely incompatible things into a single shape. Behind it, cut into the stone deeper than the rest, was an inscription, more deliberate than the surrounding carvings, as if whoever made it wanted this to survive whatever happened to everything else. Father Mikkel translated it before Raven could find the words. The thing driven into the light remembers the face that called it back. None of them slept that night. Ingrid was awake in her room at midnight when the church bell began to ring. There was no wind. No one in the village admitted to touching the rope. But the bell rang, slow, irregular, with a grief too old and too large to belong to a single event. She was already on her feet before she consciously registered being awake. When she understood she was outside, barefoot in the snow, her eyes had already adjusted from looking long enough into the dark. Something was standing among the stones of the churchyard. Her mind ran through its familiar responses first. Slope, shadow, outcrop, tree. The automatic interpretations the brain makes when it encounters something it doesn't want to process. But it moved, not much, only its head turning toward her with the slow deliberateness of something that has all the time it needs. And the face that emerged from the shadow was the part that stayed with her longest, not because it was monstrous, because it wasn't quite that. It was close enough to human that every difference felt intentional. Taller than the churchyard wall, as wide at the shoulders as a doorway, its skin the gray-brown of exposed rock, roughened by lichen and old growth, its long dark beard stiffened with ice. The eyes were deep and pale, nearly colorless, nearly without reflection, the eyes of something that had spent most of its existence in a place where light did not reach, and had learned not to need it. Snow had settled on its shoulders, as if it had come directly from the mountain, and not quite finished arriving. It did not move toward her. It made no sound. It only looked at her with a focused, patient stillness, as if everything that had happened was something she needed to know. This was not an animal passing by chance. This was not coincidence. This was a return. Father Mikkel found her still standing there, unable to step back, and pulled her into the church, locked the doors, and piled everything he could reach against them. He sat her before the altar, while the bell still swung above them, of its own accord. Ingrid asked what it wanted. He answered her honestly, doing the worst thing he could. "Not your body," he said. "Your recognition." He told her there were old accounts, not church accounts, not the kind anyone had bothered writing down in documents designed to survive. But older accounts passed from person to person in valleys like this one, about what trolls truly were in the deepest sense of the word. Not monsters, not animals. Something that had existed in these lands before the first human word for land existed. Something the new faith could not kill, could only drive deeper, hold buried under iron and prayer and stone. And sometimes, according to those accounts, a bond formed between one of the old things and a particular lineage, not chosen through ritual, chosen the way a stone remembers the shape of water that has passed over it long enough, not by decision, but by time. Her grandmother had been born in Skarsvik. Ingrid barely knew this. The family didn't speak much about the valley. Father Mikkel did. There had been a woman once, after the official conversion, who had served both, the church by day, the passage by night. She had carried offerings, rung the bell, moved between two systems that were not supposed to coexist. When the soldiers of St. Olaf had passed through the region, forcibly converting, hunting the old things into daylight with sword and scripture, turning them to stone, the village had panicked. They had closed everything off, sworn themselves to the new faith, and buried the rest beneath chapels and graves. But according to local tradition, something had not been destroyed. It had been interred, bound under the church with iron and prayer, still present, still aware, still carrying the memory of the last face that had come to it with recognition rather than fear. And the face it remembered looked like Ingrid's face. Raven refused to believe any of it. He clung to the rational frame the way people cling to the only thing keeping them standing. Misidentification, mass suggestion, folkloric projection onto ambiguous natural forms. But he could not explain the shattered headstone found at dawn, could not explain the impressions in the frozen earth of the churchyard, as if hands the size of small boulders had pressed down from above and dragged. And he could not explain how, in every photograph taken since their arrival in Skarsvik, Ingrid's face had changed in a way that should not have been possible. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone looking casually would catch. But in some frames she looked like herself. In others, she looked like someone listening to something the photograph couldn't capture. In one blurred, overexposed image from the cave, she was standing beside the stone seat, with her head turned slightly toward it, in the posture of someone who has just heard their own name from an unexpected direction. In the end, there was no choice but to go back down. The priest believed the passage needed to be closed again. properly this time, with the right materials and the right rites in the right order. Raven believed that beneath everything was a mechanism that could be documented and survived if approached correctly. Ingrid had stopped believing in any explanation. She had only begun to believe in the necessity of an ending. And so, when the sky was the color of old bone, and the mountains looked like headstones for something buried on a geological scale, just before sunrise, the three of them went down beneath the church with iron nails, lamp oil, a great many crosses, and the bent silver cross from the stone seat. They did not reach the cave alone. Halfway through the tunnel, the darkness ahead shifted, a sound like rock tearing, the deep structural sound of load-bearing things giving way. And then a smell, wet earth and something older than earth. Raven raised his lamp, and the light caught a hand resting against the rock wall, fingers like old roots, as thick as Ingrid's wrist. The thing had folded itself into the passage in a way that exceeded comfort for the sake of being present in a space too small for it. Up close it was worse in a specific way, not more monstrous, but more expressive. The face was wounded, it was angry, possessive in the way that comes from duration rather than violence. Its eyes did not go to Raven or to Father Mikkel. They stayed on Ingrid with the patience of something that had outlasted kingdoms. Raven collapsed. He cried out and fell back staggering, and his lamp hit the stone floor and shattered, and for a moment there was almost nothing. Only Father Mikkel's trembling lantern and thin grey dawn light filtering down from an impossibly great distance above. The troll advanced with a sound that had no human scale. Ingrid's hand, moving without decision, found a groove in the wall, a notch hidden beneath centuries of accumulated soot and damp, cut in the exact shape of what it held. Something moved in her without choice. She pressed the bent silver cross into the groove. The mountain answered. A slab fell between them, with enough force to shake the ceiling dust. Father Mikkel seized Ingrid's arm and pulled her through an opening he could have sworn wasn't there a moment before. On the other side of the falling stone, Raven's voice cut off mid-cry. The sound the troll made was not a roar. It was the sound of something that had been holding the same grief for too long, and could no longer find a reason to keep holding it. Father Mikkel pulled Ingrid into a smaller chamber beyond, somewhere the air smelled of ash and old pine resin, and on the wall ahead was a scene painted in pigments that had survived in the dark because the dark had protected them. A woman in church linen, standing at the entrance to the mountain beside a creature, one hand on the bell rope, the other flat against the stone, her face close enough to Ingrid's that denial would have been dishonest. Father Mikkel understood before he had formed the words. "It didn't choose you," he said. "It chose the lineage that kept coming back to it. Whatever arrangement had existed in this place, made through fear or faith, or some combination of the two that no longer had a name, had not ended when the chapel was built above it, or when the passage was sealed. It had only waited, clinging to resemblances, to blood, to the incomplete shape of recognition passing down through generations. Ingrid looked at the painting for a long time, at the woman suspended between two systems, fully belonging to neither, serving both. The valley had let men name everything in their own terms, pagan, Christian, monstrous, sacred, but the arrangement beneath had consumed the living and made the dead wait, with the patience belonging to things that do not experience time as we do, waiting for the right face to come back within reach. It was tired of reaching. When the troll broke through the wall of the side passage, stone splitting around its shoulders like something being born, Ingrid raised the bell striker Father Mikkel had brought wrapped in cloth. A solid iron thing made for a church bell that had not rung of its own accord in a century until last night, and struck it against the wall where an old painted sun symbol lay half buried beneath a carved cross in the rock. The sound that came from this impact was not what she had expected. It was complete, not loud enough to damage hearing, but filling the space so entirely that nothing else fit inside it. The oldest thing in the valley, and the most sacred thing in the valley, pressed into a single note, a single instant of metal and stone. The troll retreated. Cracks spread across its face, the way they spread through rock when heat that has been building pressure finally finds a path. The second strike drove the sound deeper into the stone. The creature reached toward Ingrid with its enormous hand, no longer in anger, not with the earlier possessive rage, but with something that in the wavering lantern light looked disturbingly close to supplication. This was the part she could never speak about clearly afterward, not the strength, not the size, its unwillingness to let go. The third strike split the ceiling. Daylight entered in a column, thin, winter-white, heatless, unapologetic. It found the troll's shoulder first, then its jaw. The skin of stone and lichen hardened where the light touched it, the way water finally solidifies when it has grown cold enough. One long, shuddering breath, and in that breath, Ingrid heard a grief too old to belong to any single lifetime. Then the rest of it hardened, collapsed inward, and became what a geology report would call a localized structural failure, consistent with known mineral instability in the region. Professor Raven's body was never found. Some said he had found another shaft and emerged onto the open mountain and frozen there. Some said the tunnel had taken him. Father Mikkel sealed what remained beneath the church with iron, concrete, prayer, and silence. The diocese accepted a report describing structural instability, loss of site access, and unverified local complications. The restoration work was terminated. The university filed the project under incomplete internships with unverified data. Ingrid returned to Oslo in spring with the particular resolve of someone who has survived something they cannot explain. The resolve that fear has an off switch, that ordinary life is available to anyone willing to want it enough. For a while it almost worked, but at night, usually in the hour before dawn, when the city is quiet enough that its own foundations can be heard, she wakes with the taste of iron in her mouth and the smell of wet stone around her. Church bells still catch her wrong. Her hands tighten before the sound finishes itself. Photographs of mountains in galleries and travel magazines produce in her a stillness that has nothing to do with appreciation. And once, sorting uncatalogued materials from a collapsed timber church somewhere north of Bergen in the University Museum's archive room, she found a painted wooden panel that had no business existing in any building constructed after the conversion. On it, a figure of a woman turning at the tree line towards something in the dark, not with fear, not with shock, but with the expression of someone who has just heard something they recognize and has not yet decided what to do with that recognition. In old handwriting at the edge was a note in Norwegian that the curators had not bothered to translate. She translated it herself. What is buried beneath faith does not die. It waits for the face that remembers the way back. She filed the panel. She put on her coat. She walked home the long way, through bright streets, noisy streets, streets where a person could almost convince herself that old things stay buried because the weight of the living is heavier than whatever need drives them to the surface. Almost.